Vertical farming. What is it? You've probably heard about it. It's a thing right now, and rightly so. Did you know by the year 2050, the world's population is expected to grow by another 2 billion people? Honestly, that's a lot of people and a lot of mouths to feed. Every year, our world is being affected by climate change and a growing population. We don't really know how much longer this is going to last, but what we do know is that we all need to eat, and eventually that food will have to come from somewhere. Many people believe vertical farming is the future, and if this can be done right, could potentially revolutionize the agricultural industry forever. But what the heck is it? Well, today I'm speaking with Jamie Burrows, the CEO and founder of Vertical Future, a London-based company focusing on developing game-changing technologies to grow, control, scale, and manage the production of crops. This conversation was definitely an eye-opener for me and gave me something to really think about. I learned about what it is, the challenges, and also what it could potentially do to help feed billions of people around the world. If you like any of these episodes, don't forget to subscribe, like, rate, and comment. So with that, please enjoy my conversation with Jamie Burrows. Jamie, thanks for appearing on the show. It's great to have you.
No problem. Thanks very much for having me.
I wanted to, reach out to you because I know that you're doing amazing things with Vertical Future, but vertical farming in general. But for everyone who doesn't understand what vertical farming is and what that space is all about, do you want to give a quick 1 to 2 minute spiel on what you're doing over there?
Sure. So vertical farming is essentially the growing of crops indoors under controlled conditions, and obviously the level of control very much varies on by system and company. And generally, that involves LED lighting, which again varies in terms of level of sophistication. And what we do is we grow in stacked layers, so we are effectively optimizing space and then also controlling the environment. So controlling things like humidity, temperature, airflow, all the aspects that you would find outside, but effectively protecting the crops in some ways to get more out of them. And the industry itself has been, it came about, it's probably been around for decades technically, but it's really just evolved in the last kind of 10 to 15 years, driven by activity in Japan, followed by the US, and then Europe has kind of followed suit, and it seems to be exploding globally now.
So why does, vertical farming is this concept, in my understanding, is the ability to scale through agriculture by growing certain produce in sort of like in a vertical architecture, if you will, right? And that is very different to the way we normally think about agriculture, which is big open plain fields, farming out in the middle of nowhere. Why is it so important that vertical farming now is becoming more and more important, especially in today's world?
So if you think about the traditional farming model and the way that that most food works nowadays, is we live in a world where everything's connected. So if you think about your developed countries and indeed your developing countries, quite often there's demand for thousands of different food groups that are coming from across the world. And these crops are being grown in parts of the world where the conditions suit their growth. And they're obviously being grown generally in dirt and quite often covered in pesticides as well. But if you think about the standard journey of a lettuce or a bagged salad, which is a very basic example and something that's been grown a lot in vertical farms, typically it will come from somewhere like Spain and we'll spend days and days in transport. And quite often it's coming from the US as well by plane. And that's covered in pesticides. So obviously, some of it gets lost in transit. So there's a degree of wastage as well. And it's just that's really not good for the environment, and it's not good in terms of having a product that's good for end consumers. So if you think about the role of pesticides, I think generally we're starting to move away from that. But in general, I think there have been statistics saying that we actually waste a lot of our food. So I think about a third of food goes to waste globally. So I think a lot of people think about vertical farming being something that solves food in terms of volume. And of course, we're living in a world where populations are getting much bigger and the world population is increasing and people are moving to urban centers. But for me, vertical farming is more about the distribution of food and the quality of food and being able to grow something much closer to an end consumer in a more sustainable, ethical way, reducing pressure on the environment. It's not necessarily about having more. So that's effectively where we're going. And in an age where people want transparency, they want to know about the provenance of a product, it's much easier to have control over your supply chain if something's being grown much closer to the point of consumption.
That's a good point you make, and I think there's a lot of logistics involved in transporting a lot of the produce nowadays. Where you go to your local, corner store, your fruit market, and then you're seeing things that are imported from halfway around the world, right? And you don't know exactly what led to that particular fruit in terms of the pesticides and all of those things come into play, but also the sheer amount of energy that it takes to ship one of those fruits and vegetables across the oceans and across massive distances is significant, and it eats up not just money and effort, but also the carbon footprint is quite amazing in that sense. Do you want to just explain a little bit about? You mentioned that it started in Japan, right? But how did that sort of instigate the movement for vertical farming, and how did you actually get wind of it yourself? What sort of inspired you to take what the template that sort of Japan provided in the US and sort of take that to Europe?
I think there are many drivers. So if you look at some of the points I've mentioned already around kind of provenance and location and proximity to where production occurs. But then if you look at climate change, so climate change is probably one of the biggest drivers, and those that believe that temperature could increase by as much as 4 degrees over the next 100 years or so. Some of the recent David Attenborough programs have mentioned that. So there's that. There's nutrition. There's health and fitness. There's the fact that people are becoming more aware of the quality of food and aware of where food is produced. And a lot of that comes with the digital revolution and the fact that we're seeing everything over the internet. So I think they've been some of the main drivers. And then if you look at some of the recent economic issues we've been having, if you look at the UK, we've got Brexit. We've obviously got COVID, which has placed a real spotlight on food sustainability and all kinds of sustainability and the way that we function as a planet. So I think there's many drivers that seem to be converging, and vertical farming is it's not a silver bullet that is a solution to everything, but it's certainly one thing that we could be doing as in most geographies to come up with one solution to this complex set of problems that we all face. So my interest in it got well. I'm a former. I did lots of things. I was in the U.S. military for 5 years, and then I came out and did my studies and worked in consulting and economic regeneration. And then I had some life changes. My wife and I had a couple of kids, and a lot of my previous work was very much in kind of healthcare and life sciences. Some of those projects were urban focused, and a friend of mine sent me a link to a company that was doing something that's container farming in the US, which I'm not a big believer in container farming, but I was like, well, that's an interesting concept. And just decided to go for it and set a company up here in London with my wife, Vertical Future, which has grown significantly in the last coming up to 5 years now.
What has it been like bringing vertical farming to a very congested city like London? I know that there is a lot of challenges that you face, and especially about that movement in general. I'm sure that having some sort of agricultural company based in London is a very atypical to a lot of tech companies out there, but not just tech, but just in terms of that space in general. Did you face any challenges? How was it sort of starting up your company in a place like London?
It was interesting because I expected it to be a bit more of a crowded market, but actually, when we set up in 2016, there were probably only, I'd say, a handful of companies that were properly doing it. So there was two companies that had been doing it for kind of 5 years prior, very different models, very retail focused models. One of them went under, the other one's still going. And obviously in recent years, there's been a lot more kind of small scale vertical farms. Even now, the market, it doesn't even seem to be, don't even seem to be close to near saturation. I mean, we were doing some estimates about the amount of vertical farms that you'd have to build to cover the bagged salads that we're importing from overseas, and you're talking about millions of square meters and billions of capital investment. So really, we're just kind of tip of the iceberg. But London is a great ecosystem for technology. It's expensive to rent space here, so that was a challenge. Luckily, we have probably close to 30,000 food businesses, although obviously COVID has had a big impact on the food industry recently. So it's been very very receptive. We had very very good time first couple of years, but the first couple of years in terms of growing the business were also very difficult. We bootstrapped it. We took a loan from the bank, which we were very lucky to get. And it was really just myself, my wife, and a couple of other kind of part-time people that built the business over those first 3 years or so. Got it just about into profitability, and then when we were able to do our first seed round raise, that was when we were able to actually have sufficient capital to bring people in. I think people underestimate, especially when you're talking about producing commodity effectively, which is very low price point. Even if you're producing, have a premium play within the vertical farming sector, it's still relative to other goods that people produce in other industries is still very, very low. So you have to go for a volume play in order to effectively make money. And we started with a small farm because that's we only had enough capital to build a small farm. So we've always had to work on that basis. So I think that made it very tough, but luckily made it through that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you mentioned about the ability of funding money, funneling money into your particular startup, but at the same time trying to bootstrap yourself with your loan and sort of getting into that space. Because I can imagine, especially when it comes to vertical farming and knowing what's involved, especially when it comes to materials, resources, the technology that, and also the space, the real estate that you're occupying at the same time. I'm sure that would have been a huge challenge to really sell, especially to investors, about getting that started. What was some of the reception like when you were pitching your idea to these investors?
Yeah, I think we got quite lucky because we found some really good, I'd say, friends and family run investors, and I set up a board, non-exec board, very early on, even in the first year, and they all joined the round, and we found some excellent guys who were working in things like asset management, some of the big firms that really believe in urbanization and how we use space. So they invested. So that was our kind of first bit, and then I think we probably raised about 300 grand, and then when we went out to VCs, we got quite lucky because we found a very good VC that backed us, and it was really one of our first conversations. I think we closed also during the summer period where most VCs are away, and I think from initial conversation to close was maybe a couple of months, if that. So yeah, we were lucky, and I think the VC that we brought on board were very receptive to. They knew about vertical farming. I think they've been dipping their toes in it, and they understood it. So it was an easy sell in some respects, but of course, raising capital is an incredibly stressful period for anyone.
Did you have a functioning prototype? What did you have when you had that initial round of investment coming in, the 300 grand you mentioned, but did you have anything functional at that point in time, or did you just really have an idea, a pitch deck, and then you sort of went with that?
Had a very comprehensive pitch deck and very comprehensive model. So I've always believed in having a really detailed model that is based on actual data. So I think you see different levels of models being provided to investors, and ours was growing data that we had actually developed ourselves. So it had a lot of credibility. But yeah, I think it was it was a little bit challenging, but we kind of got there in the end. I think in terms of the level of information, also where we were in our prototyping process, we really just had ideas when we went out to our round. So when we had our seed round, which was September last year, September 2019, we effectively just had our operational farm. We still had a very small team, but we had big ideas about what we wanted to do and the kind of system that we wanted to build. But at that stage, we were effectively still just growers, growing produce and selling it into the market. Since then, we've built our effectively built the technology side of our business, which has diversified our offering.
And that brings me to another question that I've always been interested in about, because here in the Valley and still in the Bay Area and San Francisco, you know, everyone knows about the amount of capital that's available and of the amount of ideas that come through. But I'm now starting to see a shift in drivers, that is technology drivers, that is, and especially that are moving towards not just other cities in the US, but also countries like the UK and Europe and what have you, where they're starting to develop their own technology hubs, if you will. And I just want to understand the perspective from you, because you've been down that road and you're in that space right now. Just generally speaking, what is the overall sentiment of technology growth and innovation in the UK, or maybe in Europe in general, if you can speak to that? Because I know that there's a lot of friends of mine have been thinking about moving to Europe and to London to pursue engineering jobs and do things over there. What is sort of the overall feel like at the moment over in the UK with regards to investment, to venture capital, and all of that stuff?
Well, my impression, if I look at because obviously we're doing our Series A already at the minute, so we speak to a lot of investors from the US. We speak to those in Europe and actually all over the shop. We found that if you look specifically at the vertical farming sector, that a lot of the investments, the big investments that have gone into the US, into vertical farming companies there, have generally been backing a brand. So you get reported valuations from kind of publicly available information, a massive, but it hasn't necessarily been focused on intellectual property or technology. Our sector is quite unique in some respects because I think it's impossible to build a vertical farming business where you have completely protected IP in every single area, because effectively a vertical farming system is a collection of lots of different aspects. So I think there have been some companies that have said, we've got a patent on a vertical farm, and I just don't believe in that. So our strategy has always been, first to market. We've patented, bits of our technology that we can. But we've gone for more of a rounded offering. But I think the general sentiment for the technology businesses, especially in London and other kind of hubs like Frankfurt, Paris, and so on, is it's good. I wouldn't say it's better or worse than the US, but I think that it's a bit more of an open market here, and you get a bit more of a diversified market than you do in the US, where you've got you can apply. If I speak again about vertical farming, you can apply it in lots of different ways in lots of different geographies. But no, I think in general people are very keen. There's a lot of investors in the UK who very interested in SaaS solutions, so interested more in the data side of things. I think there's probably a greater investor ecosystem for that, as opposed to investors who are interested in hardware solutions, and obviously want to put their money behind assets. So yeah, it's a slightly different mix.
Yeah, I think there's a good push for that sort of movement, especially as you mentioned, especially in London and Frankfurt. I think there's a huge migration of ideas that are moving into that area, not necessarily behind the hardware, but just in terms of certain things that can be developed, and especially in terms of vertical farming, it sounds like there's definitely a space and sort of like a slot where you can nicely fit in and grow and scale. And I wanted to understand a bit about the way the current system works. So if you take vertical farming out of the picture for now, how does how do you guys typically get your produce? And sort of explain to me the supply chain, the logistics of that. And then if you were to superimpose vertical future on top of that, how does that augment the landscape?
So if we talk about, first of all, give an example from the restaurant industry. So typically, produce will be grown either in the UK or in another geography, depending on what it is. So obviously exotic products are coming in. I think we're from overseas. I think we're importing 40 to, sorry, it's actually probably as high as 60% of our fresh produce from overseas. Quite often it will come in from overseas, and then it will come in through to a wholesaler, and then a wholesaler will stock it on a market. So somewhere, so for example, in London we have it's called New Covent Garden Market. Distributors will then come and I guess in the US they would call them like food service providers would come and pick up the produce nightly or whenever, and they'll either take it back to their distribution hub or they'll take it straight out to customers. So you've got this. We break it down into 3 price points: wholesale, distributor, and then direct to consumer. For retailers, so for big supermarkets, it's obviously slightly different. They'll get everything straight into their distribution centers or supply centers, and then it will be delivered into the supermarket aisles. For us, our model, because effectively we moved away from being growers, so we still have an operation here in London. It's a brand called Minicots that supplies over 100 restaurants. And from the beginning, our main focus was, well, we don't want to go through these wholesale or distributor channels. If you go through those channels, you can sell volume into those channels at a lower price point, but you're selling bulk is much easier. What we did is we said, right, well, let's go straight to end consumer. Let's go straight to the restaurants. Let's go straight to the catering companies in the homes. Sell at a much higher price point. Downside from that, of course, is that you have to do the distribution and the marketing yourself. So the price differential isn't as much as you would think, but it's still a great model because you get to stand behind the quality of the produce and you maintain that relationship with the end consumer. If we were just selling into distributor or wholesale channels, then there's that. In some respects, we would be just like big farms where the produce comes in, it could sit there for a few days, and then it will go out to consumer, and it could be bad or whatever. So effectively, they're putting their produce in the hands of the wholesalers and distributors from a risk-based standpoint. But of course, not everybody's going to sell straight direct into restaurants. In terms of what our technology does now, as I said, we're kind of moving away from the grower side of things, but we sell our technology systems into growers. And that might be a small farm. As I said, we don't really believe too much in the shipping container model, but say a 500 square meter farm. And effectively, we sell our systems, license our software, and then we enable effectively growers to do better at their farms. We collect data centrally, so even if it's a farm overseas, we're continually collecting and analyzing data and then sending insights back to the growers so that they can effectively operate their farms better and improve their yields, grow different products, look at different seed types, etc. So I guess that's where we fit in. But I guess the answer to the question is it really depends on the chosen model of the buyer now, because we're more of a technology play.
So that's something I really wanted to touch on as well, because looking through your content and your material, you have all of these turnkey projects that you just mentioned, and it sounds interesting and also very cool because now you're able to customize a solution for a particular client. But the way that I understand vertical farming right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we have companies here in the US as well, just literally down the road. I think they're called Ag Plenty or something, or plenty.ag, and they're also a vertical company who are selling directly to your supermarkets, and they develop the produce inside their facility, and they maintain the highest quality as possible. But they don't provide these particular types of solutions, that these turnkey solutions you're talking about. Do you want to just shed some light on how is that different from what the other players are doing in the market at the moment?
Well, I think Plenty, who you just mentioned, who have obviously had a lot of press and they've been around for quite a while. I think they had, Jeff Bezos was one of the early investors. I think they just did a $130 million deal with Driscoll's, the strawberry guys. So they're effectively a grower. They may have some internal IP. If you look at their videos, they use a lot of kind of off-the-shelf robotic arms and things like that. I'm sure they have a lot of R&D. But effectively, yeah, they're a grower, so that's their model. We we may sell technology to somebody, and then they may ask us to also operate the farm. In which case, we would use our brand, and or it might be a JV, and we develop a new brand or something off the back of that, or it might be that we just sell the technology. The example I just provided. But no, effectively our model is different. We're becoming more of an R&D company where we it's kind of like a skunk works. We have our R&D site where we continually work on ways growing our own produce to develop systems that are better for the end consumer. And the end consumer buys them, and then they have that relationship directly with the retailers or with the restaurants or the catering companies or homes, depending on their model. So it's just, I guess the difference is there's an extra link in the chain between the consumers that we're selling to and the example that you use with Plenty. If you can distinctly you can divide the vertical farming sector into two distinct areas, which is growers and technology providers, effectively. I guess at the minute, yeah, we're kind of in between the two, but going more towards the technology side of things.
Did you do enough market research in that realm to understand where you guys fit, instead of what was the advantages and disadvantages of becoming a grower versus a technology provider?
It's very different businesses. So as a grower, you're growing millions of pieces of or units of product every year, and then you're delivering them there, and they're obviously a much lower price point. With a technology based model, you don't have that kind of volume. You have distinct deals that you work to. So I think we decided that this was a better opportunity for us, because I think our journey was when we set up our first site in London in 2016, we were using very much off the shelf technology. And a lot of that technology hasn't even really moved on too much. So a lot of it, for example, Generation 1 LED lighting that's inflexible, that is very wasteful in terms of energy, and so on. Inflexible systems, no automation. And we just thought, well, I think we can do this better. And initially, when we developed our systems, we did it just for ourselves. Let's become a better vertical farming business, improve our margins. And then through that process, through some very light marketing, we just realized actually there's a lot of people who want our systems as well. And then our model just evolved from there, really. And our pipeline now, we're doing projects in Singapore and the Middle East. We're obviously doing a lot of projects across the UK. And even despite COVID, we've continued on. And the demand's massive, but fundamentally, it's a completely different business model than being a grower. And I think as a grower as well, there's a lot more risk in some respects, because you're growing fresh produce for starters, but also running a growing operation is it's not easy. It's tough. So you can only have so many farms. But I think being a technology provider, you can have a lot more farms in different locations, and then we focus more on the data side of things, which is another great value add for growers. But I think you can only be really, really good at one or two things. You need to choose what they are. You can't spread yourself too thin.
Yeah, I think that's a interesting play by you guys, because when I first heard about you, I was like, okay, they're a vertical farming company, they're in ag tech, and they're probably definitely must be growers. But then, you look at the material that you have, your website, and you start to dig deeper, and you realize, okay, they have something else going on here. This is not just another run-of-the-mill vertical farming company. They're trying to do something different, unique, and innovative, and trying to take a template of what you guys have and then sort of scale that template out to thousands and many clients around the world, so they can take the technology that you have. I guess you're licensing that technology in some respects.
So we sell the tech, we sell the hardware, and then we license the software. But yeah, I just picking up on your point there. I think one thing that we realize with a lot of your kind of end consumers now, people that want to get into vertical farming, whether it's a corporate or it's an existing food producer or an entrepreneur, they lack a lot of information and insights. And I think one of our big value adds is that we've been a grower, and we continue to be a grower, and we understand how to grow different types of products. We understand how to market them, how to sell them, and we can transfer that information onto a buyer of our system. So that adds a lot more value. We're not just sitting here saying we've designed a nice technology system. Here you go. Good luck. It's a lot broader than that. And then we've got a very interesting wraparound R&D pipeline where we've got partnerships ranging from phytopharmaceuticals through to growing crops in space, through to kind of different types of seeds that you can use, and looking at things like genetics as well. And we've brought in to kind of deliver on all that. We've brought in a very experienced plant science, software, and engineering teams. Again, to make ourselves different and stand out, to create more of a holistic, rounded offering, which is how we differentiate ourselves.
Yeah, I want to quickly touch on the technology just in a little bit, but just going back to your point about selling the hardware and the technology and licensing that to particular customers around the world. Just if you can, maybe walk me through the process, because let's say I'm a customer. I go to your website, like, look, I'm really interested in your services and your offerings. How do I become a partner of with Vertical Future? Let's say I'm based in Australia or the US. Can you walk me through that sort of like that process from day one all the way until they're finally equipped with everything they need to get started? How does that entirely work?
First of all, it's important to say that even a small site, 500 square meter site, is still going to be probably a 6 to 9 month project before you even have a fully built farm, because it just takes that long. Equally, but maybe a 10,000 square meter site is maybe only 3 to 4 months longer than that. It's a lot of that early selling process, that negotiation process, is very much focused on understanding what the customer wants, understanding, do they have a site? Do they have a business model in mind? Do they need support with that? Do they have off-takers, people that are going to buy their produce? Because a lot of people want to get into it, but they don't think about the effort you have to go to actually sell it. Do they require support in terms of plant science? Have they got the right kind of team? So in some respects, those first couple of months, we in effect do due diligence on the potential buyer as well, because we don't want to sell a system to somebody who's going to fail, because there will be a lot of that. If you look at the noise in the vertical farming sector right now, and some very good models and companies, but a lot of very basic models where it's like that kind of finance term, the principal agent problem, where effectively people are going to fail, and we don't want to be in bed with somebody like that effectively. So yeah, it's that, and then a lot of modeling. If it's an international project, and again, we're just doing our first international project, so I can't talk to loads of previous experience, especially with COVID at the minute. We go out there and obviously check out the site. At the minute, we're doing a lot of it remotely, going through detailed plans for the sites. Vertical farming, in effect, it's an infrastructure project. So the modeling element, looking at the NPV, all these aspects is very, very important. But what we've learned, and I think this is critical, is if you want to do international projects, you need to have partners that understand the dynamics, the culture of the regions that you're selling into, and that also have the contacts. We're not naive enough to think that we can just produce everything here in the UK and ship it out, and that's it. So we've built. I can't tell you the specifics yet because it's going to be in the press next kind of 6 weeks. But we've built very good partnerships in 2 regions in the Middle East and in Singapore, and that's all I'll say on those. But
No, I think that's very cool, and I know that the technology obviously has a big part to play in all of this. Not just a logistical effort, but being able to separate yourselves and have that competitive advantage. And I do like, one of the things I love interviewing people about, whether it be vertical farming or self-driving cars and whatever, is sort of digging deeper into the technology aspect of it. And I know that there are certain things you can and cannot talk about, but from just a high level, just to at least for the listeners to understand a little bit about how vertical farming comes together, not just a grower, but just as a technology provider, there's a lot of stuff that comes into play here. Many layers. You have the sensors, the automation, the data analytics, the big data, the cloud. Um, how can you explain to me just a little bit about the monitoring aspect So, we all hear about IoT, but IoT in your home, your Alexa, your Google, but there's IoT in vertical farming as well. You have these sensors, these lights that you're playing with that are remote, that require access from wherever you are, right? How does IoT contribute to your company, and how does it add value?
Sure. So our solution, I used the word holistic. We very much join up the hardware and software elements. We've got an IoT engineer, and we've got a couple other contract programmers who've really supported us over the last couple of months in terms of professionalizing everything. And I would actually say that joining up the software element with the hardware element has actually been the most challenging aspect. We have a central software system, which is a SaaS product that we've developed called Diana, that we named after Wonder Woman, which was my wife wasn't very happy about, but we wanted to come up with an interesting name. And effectively, Diana is the brain of everything. So if you look at a lot of products that other vertical farming companies have developed, they're quite basic in what they offer. So they will allow you to like switch the lights on and off, change the temperature and the humidity, and kind of monitor that. Ours goes a lot further than that in terms of things like space and dynamics and resource allocation. So we, for example, have RFIDs attached to all of our different traits. So we create 3D models to actually show where everything is within the growing environment. And then that allows us to kind of extrapolate information and figure out, how can, what can we be growing, where is it in the farm? If there's a potential issue with a product and we have to track it back, we can do that. So the RFID is pretty critical. We also have different types of sensors, including cameras, that effectively allow us to look at different stages of the growing process, although there's a trade-off, because obviously you're not going to have a sensor every meter squared, and that's going to obviously drive the capex up. These are plants; they take time to grow. So I think you don't. I think people think that a vertical farm has to be really, really sophisticated in terms of technology, but you don't need something that's super real time, because changes in plants are very, very gradual. So you don't need some of your hardware elements don't need to be super high performing. So if you look at our control boxes, etc., we started by using things like Arduinos and Raspberry Pis, and now we obviously moved to having our own PCBs. We also are working with pretty much everything in our system is our IP stuff that we've worked on, especially around the hardware and the software element as well. But we have brought in a couple of partners for some elements. So, for example, we have a research grant around seed treatment using cold plasma, which means we don't have to use any chemicals. That's interesting as well. And then we've got an analytics company that uses a particular type of camera to monitor plant stress, because obviously if you can look at a plant in that way, you're going to be able to see it before the visible spectrum. So that's another way that we integrate with Diana. But Diana in the future will move more towards being an optimizer. We have one product at the minute that we sell to customers, and it has all these elements like the resource allocation. It's got an EMU which shows all the different aspects of the growing environment. It's got a feature in there which is effectively a plant and R&D library, so you can pull data from Vertical Future Central and figure out the kind of different plant trials you can be running. And there's also a CRM tool that we're building. So it's very very broad, but it's in terms of the importance of sensors and analytics, especially considering we've developed a system which is pretty much fully automated from beginning to end. I can't underestimate the importance of having good sensors and a link back to Diana, because if we don't have that, then what you're effectively doing is saying day one, put the plant in, and then day 25, did the plant grow well or not? And that's not good.
Does with Diana, because it is a software service, is it if you have a customer that comes to you, and obviously one of that on that offering, you will provide Diana to them, is that maintained by you and managed by you as well, or is that completely sort of isolated just for the customer to maintain and observe?
So we have a team here that we're building, because obviously we're just kind of doing our first big projects, but as the more farms that we have, obviously, the more people will have to recruit centrally to obviously manage the data side of things. So we have technicians that will physically go out to the farms and fix things. We have on the hardware side, we have spare parts and things like that for customers, and obviously we train them up to be able to replace particular things. But I think there is an expectation that there are some things that, well, there's an understanding that there's some things that we can't help with, but we've designed the system in such a way where we can do most things remotely. And going back to the hardware point, if it's obviously the more remote and further away the project is, the more difficult it is in terms of troubleshooting, or if there's an issue on the hardware or software side. So we find it important to develop relationships with different types of companies in different geographies, maybe on a contract basis. So it can be like a call out, a bit like you have for your plumbing at your house.
Got it. I feel like IoT is definitely revolutionizing a lot of industries at the moment, and it seems to me that IoT fits extremely well with vertical farming because in ag tech, it seems to me that there's a lot of applications. And if we just remove vertical farming away for now from the picture, it seems to me that you can do a lot of sensor and monitoring analysis of these particular types of produce. But more so in vertical farming, it sounds like because you have the infrastructure around it, everything's highly controlled, highly controlled. You can sort of meticulously track and monitor every piece of of your product, and I think that really provides food for thought for everyone who is consuming this because they know that there is the utmost care and the utmost diligence has gone into growing these things free of pesticides and what have you. How important is it to invest in these types of technologies? I mean, what is sort of the roadmap for the engineering life cycle, at least for vertical future in the near term?
So I think our roadmap will focus more on modularization, so having products that are more and more modular and are applicable for different, I guess, synergistic industries. So not necessarily just basic food production. So I already mentioned that we're doing stuff in phytopharmaceuticals, and having mobile kind of R&D labs and things that can be put into different areas and for different types of consumers. So I think that our focus on robotics has been, I think people have different understandings of what robotics is. So I mentioned that there are some other farms that will buy the big robotic arms, and you just tell the arm, go from here to here and repeat that motion. And that's very simple stuff. We've taken more of a simplistic approach to effectively automation across our growing environments. I think we'd probably like to do more in that space, continue to innovate. And when I say innovate, it's about having more control and also being able to bring the price point down. Because at the minute we have a solution which is competitive. It's more premium than probably a lot of your kind of more simple vertical farming solutions, but it delivers better margins because of the automation and the level of control, etc. But I think doing more in the robotic space and just continually innovating there. Obviously, lighting as well is a critical area. So we have fully adjustable lights throughout the entire growing environment. So if you compare the 5 different LED types we have, which go from UV, and the fact that you can change intensity for every light, you can effectively have millions of different combinations. Now, from an R&D standpoint, that means that we could spend years or decades sitting there testing because it could be weeks or months to test a particular product, to test the impact of light on a particular crop. But then if you look at again from an R&D standpoint, it gets more complicated because you've got lots of other variables in vertical farms. So yeah, there's many things we could be focusing on, but probably lighting, robotics, and also maybe on the logistics side of things as well. I think we'd like to be better.
So if, just to touch on this point one more time, if you do come up with a next generation of hardware or lighting solution, and you have existing customers out there who are on a previous generation and they're scattered around the world, what is the upgrade process for those things? Does that mean that you have to go out individually to each of your clients and farms to upgrade the hardware? Because the software update is more or less quite easy, but when it comes to hardware, what's the process like there?
Well, first of all, on the hardware side, if you look at our growing systems, obviously I haven't explained too much about them, but we've developed a system which is very flexible. So one of the one of the perceived market failures is that, or at least from our side, is that people build these kind of rigid, fixed systems with particular heights from seed up to the lighting, and then they have an understanding on day one about what they want to grow. But in the future, in 2 3 years time, they may experience demand shock, or they want to grow something different, and then they have to fundamentally change the structure of their systems. We've developed suspended systems that you can effectively change the dynamics of very quickly. We've also used materials that will last 20 30 years, that won't require replacement after 5 to 10. We've come up with an LED approach which has a longer useful life. So it's an infrastructure project. Things are going to break and they're going to require replacement over time. But we've tried to approach the market in such a way where we're offering something which lasts a lot longer for consumers. I think probably the biggest element that is going to potentially advance is LED lighting, although there are some studies which indicate that LED lighting's improved like this, but now it's starting to flatten out. So we model our projects on the basis of, you have a life cycle fund, and there's an expectation that every year you're committing X% of your revenue to effectively, a piggy bank, which is going to help to replace some of your assets, and we build that into there. So that's that. But I think in terms of the logistics of going out and replacing, it's important to have local teams to develop support teams in different geographies. But yeah, hopefully this won't be too much of an issue, because we're very comfortable with our solution, and for the majority of the hardware, we've built something that will last a really long time.
Yeah, no, I think you touch on the point of that operations and making sure that your operational capability is up to the mark. And, it's not just an engineering problem, it's an operation problem, and logistics and scheduling and what have you. So it sounds to me that, there's a lot of layers to this. And this comes with not just agricultural or vertical farming, but any tech company in general that has hardware that they're dealing with that needs to be upgraded over a certain lifetime. um, and that sort of brings me to my next point. And I know that we're getting towards the end of the hour here, but I want to quickly touch on some of the challenges I guess some of you guys are facing. And one of the things that I usually think about when it comes to not just lighting and infrastructure and vertical farming, but also just power consumption, energy use, right? What does your model show in terms of not just the amount of power you're consuming, but the amount of water you're using as well? How have those two factors come into play and really, painted a picture for you about this is actually something that can be scaled and something that can, um, you know, outgrow and outpace the current classical way of doing things? So, what's your take there?
So there's been some bad press about LED lighting. So I think people who are kind of against vertical farming look at it and they're like, well, why move something inside when we've got this free resource outside the sun? And they don't look at things from earlier on. You mentioned energy in the supply chain. So I think when you're doing a comparative analysis and you're comparing a vertical farm versus a traditional farm, there are many different factors to take into account. That being said, it's true that most vertical farms who are using Generation One LED lighting are the economic models. I mean, they don't really stack up in some respects, especially for the very small farms. They're having to grow things like microgreens, very high margin, high turnover produce, and selling them, at premium price points to survive. And a lot of that is to do with the energy and the initial capital costs of those farms. We've taken an approach where we effectively have developed a product and a solution that in its entirety consumes a lot less energy, so between 40 and 60% less than most other lighting solutions in vertical farms. And a lot of that is to do with the way that we've designed the farm from an engineering standpoint. We've also taken a non-traditional approach to things like HVAC systems, so very very different approach there, because that's effectively your second biggest cost behind the lighting. But it's true, energy is something that we need to continually find ways forward with. And I guess the downside with having urban models in places like London is that you can't really link in with sustainable energy sources. So things like you can't put up a big solar farm in the middle of London. You don't have the right external conditions, the right amount of sunlight to do that. But in places like the Middle East, it's much easier to do things like that. On the water point, we've got a system which you can flip between aeroponic or hydroponic mode. Traditionally, aeroponics, which has been around for quite a while, but actually very few vertical farms use it. Most people are still doing hydroponics. Not only is lower risk in terms of things like cross contamination, also give you a lot more control, but it consumes a lot less water. So hydroponic systems, we can recirculate and treat the water, but only so many times. The aeroponic systems, they use significantly less water. So water, I'm a big believer that water's going to be, it's already becoming, the next big challenge of our time. Sustainable energy, sustainable foods, and water, things that people need to be investing in. I think we very much take it for granted. But I don't think there is as much pressure on the water issue in developed economies, again, because we take it for granted. But so projects that we're starting to build in the Middle East are, if you look at the cost of water out there, and it starts to open your eyes, and you have to think about things in a much more innovative way.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of discussions around just resource usage when it comes to these sort of things. And I think for me it's still a bit hairy about exactly what are the key advantages when it comes versus the classical way of doing farming versus taking this approach. And a lot of variables come into play because yes, you have the ability to transport a solution to the actual geography that you're going to supply the produce in. So that means you're taking out transportation, you're taking out the carbon footprint associated with that. But then at the same time, you're imposing resource use in that area alone, whether it be water usage or energy consumption. So it's an interesting question. I thought I'd just ask you because it has something that has cropped up on my mind, especially when looking into particular solutions related to vertical farming.
I mean, from a basic economic standpoint, it comes down to whether or not the material gains in output and efficiency by growing in a more controlled environment, and the gains or the improvements or net reduction in carbon effectively surpass or are greater than the potential increases in energy consumption for your base production compared to a traditional farm. I mean, that's a pretty central question. But again, it's quite a complicated formula if you look at it. And then there are other things to take into account as well. So the potential health impact of not using pesticides, the fact that vertical farms, in a sense, are encouraging a rewilding of the environment because we're moving production aside. We're not putting pressure on soil. Soil degradation is pretty rife globally. So there are many factors to consider, but I do agree that the energy point is energy and water points are central.
Yeah, no, I agree with that as well. Are there any other massive challenges that you can foresee down the road, other than the water and the energy, the sort of technology challenges? Any other maybe regulatory or anything like that 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 you have to face in down the road?
On the regulatory side, governments are starting to better understand vertical farming and it's becoming more central to their strategies. So if you look in places like Singapore, they're way ahead. Mind you, Singapore are way ahead in most things. So I think that there'll probably be more barriers to entry in the future for vertical farms. I think more broadly, the main challenges for the industry right now are sorting the good from the bad. And I think because it's the hot topic of the month or the year or the decade, there are different types of models that are coming to light, and vertical farming is not as simple as let's just get some shelves and stick some light on it and then start selling produce. I mean, there's health and safety things to consider. There's plant science to consider. There are huge differences in, for example, I talked about things like asset life and efficiency. It's far more complex than people think. And the problem is you have a lot of, like I said, a lot of very good examples, but equally there's a lot more bad examples of advanced vertical farming systems, or so-called, that I've got my slight worry is that there will be some failures in the market, and that may create bad press for the wider vertical farming industry when we're actually trying to do something really really good. And it may take a while for those failures to materialize, but they, like most sectors, I guess, they mistakes happen, and there are always companies that fail. But it's because we're doing something so important that addresses so many issues. We want to minimize the number of failures.
Yeah, and you mentioned the importance of that and what you're trying to do with the industry. Just to sort of finish off with the conversation, I want to understand a little bit about the motivation that drove you to do this. Vertical farming is not an easy thing to do. You can't just wake up one day and say, "I'm going to start a company that focuses on vertical farming," and here I go. What compelled you to really get out of your comfort zone from what you were doing before to really pursuing this idea of yours?
So basically, I prior to setting the company up, I lost both my parents to cancer, which was pretty horrific. And I was working in a very stressful job. Had a couple of kids, my wife, and just really wanted to do something different. So I guess that just pushed me forward. And I don't know, in some respects, maybe it was an early life crisis where I just wanted to do something different. And to be honest with you, before setting the company up, I hadn't grown a thing in my life. So it was a real learning process, and spent a couple of years doing everything from seeding and harvesting and deliveries and taking bags out to restaurants, and just learned the business from the bottom up. And I think that's been really really helpful in terms of helping with this next phase of the business. We almost made it the whole way without the without the 99%.
No, I appreciate it. I think I got the gist of it, and that's really amazing to hear that you've decided to take on a venture that was challenging, but also worthwhile as well. Because I think the stuff that you're doing is really important, and it's a very early industry right now, and who knows what's going to happen with regards to the technology, the movement, and for me specifically, I would love to one day taste produce that has grown in a vertical farm, and I would love to, at some point maybe when I have once a vaccine is in order, I can make a trip to visit you guys. And maybe you can show me around because that would be awesome to see what sort of facility that you've built up for you.
Yeah, you're more than welcome to. Just let me know.
Thanks, Jamie.
Brilliant. Thank you.